So good morning again, everyone, and welcome to our From the Headlines season finale. We've been covering various headlines and topics throughout the course of this past year. We take a summer hiatus from this slot. Other classes are going to be offered, and stay tuned for those opportunities as well. But you can't ask for anything more than a topic that from the headlines that everyone's paying attention to and will continue to pay attention to. Really, people have been asking for a discussion on this subject since the Supreme Court's decision leaked last month. This we're going to try and tackle this, the overturning of Roe v. Wade through a Jewish lens and look at what happened, some of the reactions to what happened, some of the Jewish sources, and then some of the approaches to be taken going forward. I think that it's a very emotional issue for people. It's a very personal issue for people. It's obviously, especially for women, this is an issue that is relevant to them and their bodies. And for families, it's a major issue that comes up, and it impacts all sorts of areas of life, whether it be religion, whether it be mental health, whether it be society, whether it be community. I would imagine that many people who are zooming in this morning have some specific opinions on the subject, and this will not be the opportunity to go around the room and each of us share our views, but I have the mic and want to just present the issue. I think a couple of words of introduction, from a halachic perspective, when it comes to Jewish law, it's always very complicated. It's, especially when there are issues that have multiple approaches, as we'll see, which of those approaches are the ones which rise to the top or get followed, and then which rabbinic sources and voices have held onto those approaches is something that is something that definitely is prevalent in the community and leads to different views and different voices and different approaches. But suffice it to say, I think that in general, for the most part, Jewish traditional sources, Gemara, Halacha, approaches of the overwhelming majority of rabbinic voices in the more recent era, don't look at abortion as black and white. It's always a variated situation depending on the different variables of that situation. So with those opening remarks, let's go to the headlines. All right, this is from Reuters last week. U.S. Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, ends constitutional right to an abortion. So let's look at the snippet from here and to get us underway. U.S. Supreme Court on Friday overturned the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling that recognized women's constitutional rights to an abortion, a decision condemned by President Joe Biden that will dramatically change life for millions of women in America and exacerbate growing tensions in a deeply polarized country. The court, in a 6-3 ruling powered by the conservative majority, upheld the Republican-backed Mississippi law that bans abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. The vote was 5-4 to overturn Roe, with conservative Chief Justice John Roberts writing separately to say he would have upheld the Mississippi law without taking the additional step of erasing the Roe precedent altogether. The ruling restored the ability of states to ban abortion. In a concurring opinion that raised concerns the justices might roll back other rights, conservative Justice Clarence Thomas urged the court to reconsider past rulings protecting the right to contraception, legalizing gay marriage nationwide, and invalidating state laws banning gay sex. The justice in the ruling, written by conservative Justice Samuel Alito, held that the Roe decision that allowed abortions performed before a fetus would be viable outside the womb, which occurs between 24 and 28 weeks of pregnancy, was wrongly decided because the U.S. Constitution makes no specific mention of abortion rights. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, in a concurring opinion, appeared to nix an idea advocated by some anti-abortion advocates that the next step is for the court to declare the Constitution outlaws abortion. The Constitution neither outlaws abortion nor legalizes abortion, Kavanaugh wrote. Kavanaugh also said that the ruling does not let states bar residents from traveling to another state to obtain an abortion or retroactively punish people for prior abortions. So there's a specific decision on the Mississippi law that was upheld. There was the less widespread view of overturning Roe. There was the Clarence Thomas view of opening up other cases as well. And then there was the Kavanaugh statement that this isn't going to necessarily, will not lead to outlawing all abortions or punishing people who get abortions where they're permissible. All of these are topics that are being heatedly discussed as to what the next steps are going to be. Certain types of contraceptives in the morning after pill are now in short supply. There's a run on the medications, right? But it starts with the Roe v. Wade essentially set up a constitutional right to an abortion, and this right was withdrawn in the Supreme Court decision, while in particular, specifically, this one state's law to have an abortion, banning abortion after 15 weeks, was upheld, moving the needle, I guess, from what had been viewed as 24, 28 weeks as the moment of viability. Abortions before that being protected, the general protection is gone, and the ability to ban abortions for 15 weeks was upheld. And this is setting up a whole sorts of rules in different states that have passed laws waiting for this moment, and has thrown a whole the issue of abortion, what comes next, into the forefront of debate. So what was some of the Jewish reaction to this decision? So we're going to present three reactions from the Jewish community. We're going to start with Agudath Israel of America. Agudath Israel of America represents what's called the ultra-Orthodox community, the yeshiva community, the more often viewed as the more right-leaning part of the Orthodox community, although I think that's a generalization. But in this case, Agudath Israel of America welcomes Supreme Court overruling Roe v. Wade. Agudath Israel has long been on record as opposing Roe v. Wade's legalization of abortion on demand. Informed by the teaching of Jewish law that fetal life is entitled to significant protection with termination of pregnancy authorized only under certain extraordinary circumstances, we are deeply troubled by the staggering number of pregnancies in the U.S. that end in abortion. Right? Abortion on demand leads to this, and therefore we do not seek to impose our religious beliefs on the broader American society, which is important because we're going to come back to that. We are of the view, however, that society through its laws should promote a social ethic that affirms the supreme value of life. Allowing abortion on demand, in contrast, promotes a social ethic that devalues life. To be sure, there are certain extraordinary circumstances where faith teaches that a woman should terminate her pregnancy. Agudath Israel fully supports her right to an abortion in such situations, both as a matter of constitutional free exercise and moral principle. However, it must be reiterated that these cases are indeed extraordinary, rare exceptions to the rule that fetal life is entitled to protection. So Agudath Israel of America feels that this was a welcome decision because of a trend within society of devaluing human life. The idea of I think that pretty much everything they say in that statement is something that does resonate with the sources on Jewish law. The fact that in general, as we will see when we look at the sources, Jewish law also is not never sanctions abortion on demand. But in some level, what was it that people have been invoking? What Bill Clinton said about abortion. So Bill Clinton, Democratic president of the United States, what did he say about abortion? It should be safe, legal, and rare. The idea that the idea for that abortion should be available on demand, maybe beyond when when people are comfortable with the idea of late-term abortions, the partial birth abortions, right? These are all subjects that are part of the conversation. Sometimes it gets distilled into pro-choice and pro-life, yes and no. But in general, I think in many ways both sides have responsibilities to try and present what they're hoping to accomplish. What's the aspiration as opposed to just the technical ruling? And so Agudath Israel says we welcome this because we love life. Doesn't mean that any people who are pro-choice don't love life, but at least Agudath Israel saying the direction or the ethos within American society with the Roe v. Wade on the books doesn't necessarily ride in consonance with the Jewish approach to life. And again, they say clearly, although they don't lead with it, that they want abortions to be permissible when necessary, and they invoke this as being a constitutional free exercise and moral principle, but they're putting the emphasis on the Roe v. Wade being overturned as a positive thing, being in consonance with more life. That's Agudath Israel. Let's look at the Reform movement. So the Reform movement, and you can see this on the Reform's Religious Action Center website. All these statements are available online. So they didn't present one statement. They presented some views of three of their from the leadership team. So they denounced the Supreme Court's decision. And again, we can think about the language that's used: denounce versus condemn versus oppose versus applaud versus welcome. But Reform denounce. First, I have Rabbi Marla Feldman, the executive director of Women of Reform Judaism. Right, a woman's voice definitely relevant in this case. So we are outraged that the Supreme Court today stripped women and others who can become pregnant of the fundamental right to make essential healthcare decisions free of government interference. As we navigate the catastrophic results of the court's decision, we work to ensure Congress and state legislators do everything in their power to protect and improve access to abortion and our fundamental rights. We will not be silent as the court tries to turn back the clock 50 years. All right, so we have to keep moving forward. We shouldn't be moving backward. Again, obviously, we're not surprised that they are different than Agudath Israel. Now, Yolanda Savage Narva, Assistant Vice President of Racial Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion of the Union for Reform Judaism, right? Reform Judaism, definitely a more progressive denomination than Agudath Israel, than Orthodoxy, than even the conservative movement. So they want a voice, from the, of diversity presented and reacting to this. This decision, which is rooted in anti-Black racism, white supremacy, and other systems of oppression, will have disastrous consequences. We must come together to take sustained action to support those whose human dignity and fundamental rights are and will be violated and stripped away. As Jews, we are commanded to do so. All right, so invoking that there's a Jewish imperative to stand up for these rights, but in particular, I would say that in my own reaction, the idea of this being anti-Black racism and white supremacy. Does that mean if you applauded the decision, you're a white supremacist? Is this political language? Is this is this more is this more strategic language? Again, the reaction is this is anti-white. This is a racist decision. And then the head of the Reform Religious Action Center. Right, we vehemently condemn the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs, which overturns Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. The decision is wrong, full stop. Gives the green light to abortion bans that will eliminate or severely restrict access to nearly half U.S. states and threatens other fundamental rights. Efforts to restrict abortion access also undermine the religious freedom of people who, as in the Jewish tradition, uphold abortion care as a medically necessary and righteous procedure. Right, there's certain resonance between what Jonah Dov Pesner is saying with what even Aguda said in terms of invoking there being a religious freedom, having that type of religious freedom, medically necessary, right? Even Agudath Israel recognized that that's possible. Whether abortion is a righteous procedure all the time, that's where you'll begin to, draw the two sides apart. It's more a function of what do we lead with. And I feel that the Orthodox Union, the OU statement, which actually came out when the decision or the draft of the decision was leaked, tries to thread the needle. It definitely resonates more with me than the Aguda statement, source number 4. The Orthodox Union is unable to either mourn or celebrate the U.S. Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade. We cannot support absolute bans on abortion at any time in a pregnancy that would not allow access to abortion in life-saving situations. Similarly, we cannot support legislation that does not limit abortion to situations in which medical, including mental health professionals, affirm that carrying the pregnancy to term poses real risk to the life of the mother. The quote-unquote right to choose, as well as the quote-unquote right to die, are thus completely at odds with our religious and halachic values. Legislation and court rulings that enshrine such rights concern us deeply on a societal level, yet at that same mandate to preserve life requires us to be concerned for the life of the mother. Legislation and court rulings federally or in any state that absolutely ban abortion without regard for the health of the mother would literally limit our ability to live our lives in accordance with our responsibility to preserve life. The extreme polarization around and politicization of the abortion issue does not bode well for much needed nuanced result. Human life, the value of everyone created in divine image, is far too important. So I think that last statement says a lot about where statements and protests and the like are going, that we've divided everyone into two camps. You're either for or against, but it's not from a traditional Jewish perspective. It's more complicated than that. And so that's the statement of the OU, which will be a springboard for a discussion of the sources relating to abortion. We'll look at some of the verses and Talmudic teachings relating to it. Then we'll look at some of the rabbinic literature. And like I said at the beginning, the overwhelming view within all that emerges from all this is as we saw in the statements of Aguda and the OU, that there is room for abortion. In a sense, it's like Bill Clinton said, rare, safe, legal. Those can be applied to the Jewish view on abortion as well. So when we look at some of the sources and the paths that Jewish traditional sources, halacha, takes to abortion, you have kind of three pieces, three paths. One is this idea of from a religious perspective, when is there viability? We call this the 40 days issue. And then we have the idea that the fetus is in some level part of the mother, and it doesn't necessarily have viewed as a life unto itself, which doesn't necessarily allow for abortion on demand, but does allow for certain mitigation and permission or leniency. And then we're going to see that there are sources which actually look at the fetus as an independent entity, as life. So starting with source number 5, the Mishnah in Nida talks about a woman who miscarries on the 40th day need not be concerned that it might have been offspring and she became impure with its miscarriage, as the formation of the offspring in the womb occurs only 40 days after conception. Right, this is the idea that impact the laws of purity and impurity, and today impact the laws of firstborn, pidyon haben. Right, if a woman miscarries, unfortunately, after 40 days, then if she has a child and that first child is a male child, that child is not considered a firstborn halachically, because that miscarriage after 40 days is considered a certain element of alive. Right, and what about before 40 days? So the Gemara in Yevamot has the expression that many people are familiar with, right? Ad arba'im maya ba'almahi. Until 40 days from conception, the fetus is merely water. It doesn't have a physical status. So you have this idea that there's certainly a period in Jewish law where it's not considered a life, it's not considered viable. When we talk about time frame, right? 40 days is 6 weeks. A little less than 6 weeks, but you have 6 weeks that it seems from the way it's being presented here that this is not considered anything. It's not actionable from a viability or having a status type of a sense. So that's the 40 days piece. Then we have from Parshat Mishpatim that you have a situation when parties are fighting, right? And one of them pushes a pregnant woman, source number 7, and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues. The one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact, the payment to be based on the reckoning. Right, so if you injure a pregnant woman who miscarries, there's a financial penalty. There's a damage. It's not considered having taken a life. It's considered having damaged, right? And Bava Kama 78b has an expression in the Talmudic quote. It's ubar yerach imo. A fetus is considered as its mother's thigh. It's part of the woman. You break someone's arm, you have to pay for it. You cause a miscarriage, you have to pay for it, right? It's emotionally clearly not the same, but from a legal standpoint, the fetus is considered something that is not alive from a capital murder type of an offense or from a damages offense. It's something that's part of the mother. We also see it not necessarily being viewed as being independent on its own. From the Mishnah and Ahalot, source number 9. If a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb, bring it forth limb by limb, because her life comes before the life of the child. Because if the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. And this is the idea that once the fetus has started coming out, and most of it is already out, then you have two side-by-side life entities, and you're not allowed to they're both, you're not allowed to set aside one person's life for that of another, which means that before that moment, and the way the Mishnah presented in the beginning, that you don't have that hesitation. It's not one versus another. Also, so you have this idea that the fetus is not necessarily independent until it is until it's mostly out of the womb. And then you have a couple of sources which seem to take the side that this is that the fetus is a life. You have a mother and a fetus; those are both two different living entities, and there can sometimes be competing values. Sources for this approach can be seen in Gemara and Erechim, source number 10. A woman who dies while sitting on the birthing stool on Shabbos, we bring a knife to tear open her abdomen and remove the fetus. Right. So the idea here, what's happening is that you're going to carry for the woman is Rahmana Litzlan is dead, but you're going to carry a knife when you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos to open up the abdomen and remove the fetus. You might have said, right, the permission was given because it had at least the presumption of having been alive, but where it's the embryo did not have the fetus really, did not have such original presumption of life, one might say no desecration of Shabbos shall be permitted. Therefore, we inform that no, one may desecrate the Shabbos for the possibility of saving the fetus's life. The idea that you're violating Shabbos to save a life, you're saving the fetus. The fetus is still in the mother's womb. The Rambam also looks at the fetus as being alive. This indeed is one of the negative mitzvot. The Rambam is talking about the principle of rodef, where you're allowed to kill someone who's going to kill you. Right? Indeed, one of the negative mitzvahs not to take pity on the life of a rodef. On this basis, our sages ruled that when complications arise and a pregnant woman cannot give birth, it is permitted to abort the fetus in her womb, whether with a knife or with drugs, for the fetus is considered a rodef of its mother. If the head of the fetus emerges, it should not be touched because one life should not be sacrificed for another. Although the mother may die, this is the nature of the world. Right? It's unfortunate, it's a sad situation, but you have a mother, and remember, the Rambam talks about just the head emerging, not the majority emerging. The Rambam is looking at the fetus as being something that is alive. So this is, again, we had three pathways to looking at the concept. One is there's a period of 40 days where it seems to not have any standing. There's the idea of the fetus being part of the mother, and therefore there's an element of damage that can be applied just like you damage any other part of a person. And then you have those who look at the fetus as actually being independent, and therefore it does have its own status. And the only ways that one could kill one or the other is if you have this type of a rodef situation. So we have three ways of approaching it, and let's throw one other piece into the mix. Sanhedrin 57b, source 12. It is stated in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, the descendant of Noah, who is executed even for killing fetuses. Right? This is something that emerges, that it seems that the Talmud never is explicit about abortion being a capital offense for Jews, but it is fairly explicit that abortion is a capital offense for non-Jews. And this statement in the name of Rabbi Yishmael is something that Maimonides also quotes as a law. The idea that, and this leads to a part of the conversation, that if a non-Jew is not allowed to perform abortions, then how can a Jew perform abortions? And this is a larger discussion into how we view the 7 Noahide commandments, but this also does get thrown into the mix. So each of these paths has impacted the discussion when these issues come up. And it's not that these issues have only come up recently, right? These issues have been discussed for hundreds of years. You see source number 13, the Maharit, Rabbi Yosef ben Moshe Trani, right, 16th, 17th century. And from the fact that the Gemara says it is obvious that we can abort the fetus of the woman who was condemned, it implies as far as taking a fetal life is concerned, there's not the slightest issue of concern. Therefore, regarding a Jewish woman, in the case of the mother's need, it would appear that it's permissible to assist them to have an abortion, since it is for the sake of the mother's health. Right? That generally what emerges in the discussion of abortion, in Jewish law is it's the lane of the path of that it's damages, that it's part of the mother but not an independent entity, that it's not two different independent lives is the one where the focus is on. And then we start figuring out what are some of the mitigating circumstances. Maybe it's less than 40 days. Clearly, if the mother's health is at risk, and even the idea of maybe if there's a choice between a Jewish doctor and a non-Jewish doctor performing abortions, it should be the Jewish doctor who performs the abortion because Jews look at it as a much more serious offense for non-Jews. So this is something that has been discussed. It's something that seems to put the focus on that it's not capital offense. It's not murder to abort a fetus. Does at the same time, there's no indication, and it's clear that Jewish law isn't looking for this or seeing this as an ideal situation or permissible situation, but you're dealing with competing interests, and the fetus is not viewed as being as independent an entity of life as the mother. And as we saw in source number 13, health of the mother, the sources seem to put the focus on, if you do what you need to do in a situation like this for the health of the mother. So fast forward to when the more contemporary society, 20th, 21st century, one of the rabbis who spent a lot of time on this was Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg. He was a rabbi in Israel, so very active in the first 50 years of the state of Israel and the Chief Rabbinate Council, and he was a legal authority. Posek, people turned to him. Someone who straddled both kind of the yeshiva world and the religious Zionist modern Israel world. He was the rabbi and posek for Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. And we'll come back to in a little bit, how abortion is handled in Israel. But he provided the religious guidance for Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, and he has a summary of the halachos of when it comes to abortion, and you have them there in source number 14. We're not going to read through all of them, but just pointing out some of the things that highlights things that we've referenced that are relevant. A Noachah is executed for aborting a fetus. There is an opinion that he is not executed, right? A Jew is not executed for aborting a fetus, right? When there is a need and the law determines it's allowed, preferable to have the abortion done by Jewish doctor. Then he talks about whether or not it's a biblical prohibition or a rabbinic one. Some people say it's a rabbinical prohibition to abort, but it's a weak prohibition. Kabbalistically, in number 8, spiritually, it's a terrible thing because it has to do with the neshama and when does the soul enter the body, right? But number 9, when there's danger to the mother in continuing the pregnancy, one can allow an abortion easily. Even when there's no danger, but the mother's health is very delicate for the sake of her health or to relieve her of severe pain, it is advised to perform an abortion, even though there's no real risk to life. Even here, one can allow this according to the judgment of the doctor as he sees the case. Right, so Rabbi Waldenberg has latched onto that middle lane of the fact that this is not, the fetus is not viewed as a soul, independent soul, and therefore one is allowed to, when there's compelling need, to do so, even if it's not life-threatening. Right, a married woman who committed adultery, was raped, became pregnant, even from a non-Jew, where the child will not be a mamzer, and she has now repented. A number of great disciples are inclined to allow for an abortion because of her shame, because of the desecration of the divine name, the shame and stigma to the family, and other reasons as mentioned above. Right. In fact, a number of responsa, throughout that period where we saw the Maharit, getting into the 17th and 18th centuries, we're dealing with situations of women who were becoming impregnated from non-Jews, where sometimes it was a consensual relationship, sometimes it was, as was mentioned here, it was rape, and they talk about that being a factor. That was probably before you enter the 20th century and the Roe v. Wade era. That was where rabbis were discussing this issue, and they generally were permissive. Now, the one thing they were worried about was that if abortion became viewed as too permissible, that would lead to too much licentious behavior. Abortion on demand would lead to a loosening of sexual values and mores. And they do mention that as a concern, similar to the Aguda concern us in terms of where the society is heading today. But similar to what Rabbi Waldenberg is saying here, from a halachic perspective, it was permissible. And we see there are numerous responses from the 17th and 18th century along those lines as well. 13, to have an abortion 40 days from conception, also before 3 months from conception, is much more lenient than to do so after these periods. It is thus preferable to arrange for the abortion prior to these periods, while the fetus has not yet begun to stir, when there is a well-based concern that the fetus will be born deformed and beset by affliction. So he's now jumping on the 40-day or the early term bandwagon for when to permit abortion. He does say, at the other extreme, to kill a fetus once the woman is in the process of giving birth and the fetus has already been uprooted to emerge is much stricter than before this moment, and one cannot allow in such a case, save where there is a direct threat to the mother's life. Right? You hit the later term. He's not able to be flexible. Even in the cases where the law would allow for an abortion, nevertheless, one should get the husband's permission since it is his property, not the wife, but the child. It's a partnership here. You should be consulting the husband. And it is also preferable to have an abortion by drinking a medicine than by direct surgical means, right? In terms of people wonder about the morning after pill or chemically induced miscarriages, on purpose. That seems to be certainly allowed within Jewish law. In general, 18, all Jews are commanded with a strict decree not to deal lightly regarding ending a pregnancy. There's great responsibility in such a case, both on the one asking to have the abortion and the decisive being asked. Right? Not to mention, there is such a defense of the breaches, but when men and women, right, who will be sexually loose, if you have no consequences, then that would lead to a loosening of morality. Right? So he's touching upon all of the various areas that we saw the sources from, the 40 days, the fact that the fetus is part of the mother. We come to this from the laws of damages, right? He does not accept the fact that this idea of fetus independent viability until we get to the very end. And like his predecessors and like decisors from the 16th, 17th, 18th century, concerned about recognizing that there could be situations where extreme situations where this has been needed and was permitted, but we are concerned about the moral implications as well as the overall social setting. This isn't just the husband should be consulted, the doctor should be consulted, the rabbi should be consulted. This is all a serious social issue in addition to it being a personal issue. Just want to one other area, because we're gonna look at a moment at the opposition to Rabbi Waldenberg, the stricter voices. He points out that in the source 15 from another responsum, abortion within the first 40 days of pregnancy and also before the fetus completes 3 months is far less severe than later on. Therefore, it's permissible to permit abortion within this time period as long as there is of yet no fetal movement. If there's an established risk that the child will be deformed and suffer great pain, regarding the termination of pregnancy due to the detection of Tay-Sachs in the fetus, after seriously examining all the facts in accordance with the serious question, in my humble opinion, based on what I've already clarified, it would be possible to permit performing abortion up until the 7th month in this unique circumstance, where the consequences of continuing the pregnancy are so severe. The abortion must be performed in a manner that involves no danger involved to the mother. From 7 months on, the matter is much more severe. Notice he doesn't say forbidden, much more severe. Rabbi Waldenberg very much is the ambassador of this approach to abortion, which has the flexibility based on the approach that we're coming at this from the laws of damages. And when we're dealing with the laws of damages, there's going to be mitigation based on the situation. Right? It's one thing to not damage anything, but when the alternative is far worse, then a judgment can be made. Just from a situation, from a case that happened, Rabbi Haskell Lookstein was describing his encounters with Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the Rav. And source number 16, he mentions hearing a scholar discuss the issue of Tay-Sachs testing and advised against any kind of testing because there's certainly, especially once the woman is pregnant, don't do any testing because there's nothing you can do about it. You can't abort. And Rabbi Lookstein mentions being, disturbed by, this, didn't think that this was right. And it happened to be in the middle of the paragraph that he was going to have dinner that evening at the home of a member of the Rav's family, which the Rav was going to be present. And he had scarcely in the door when I described to him the view that had been expressed earlier that day. And I asked him what his opinion was. He said very firmly, you can abort a Tay-Sachs fetus through the 6th month. I said nothing, but he must have noted a quizzical look on my face, as if to say, which of course I would not. What was the basis? I will never forget what he told me. He said, Chatzkel, did you ever see a Tay-Sachs baby? I replied that I had not. He said, we had a Tay-Sachs baby in Boston. I tell you, you can abort a Tay-Sachs fetus through the 6th month. All right, and that is very much in consonance with what we saw from what we see from Rabbi Waldenberg as well. So that is the more permissive approach, which I think is very much a read of the sources. The sources are much more clear about early term flexibility or the fact that it doesn't really have status, as well as looking at the fetus as being a part of the mother, and from a damages perspective, and therefore if something, if there are competing interests, right? If the damaging or aborting the fetus is the price for the larger organism, for the mother's health, well-being, all sorts of mitigations, as mentioned by Rabbi Waldenberg, that's the direction we go. Only really when you get to the very end do you start dealing with this issue of maybe the fetus is an independent entity. But that's really only towards the end and in Rabbi Waldenberg's conception. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is the authority who is known for being very strict. And he feels, source number 17 is an English translation of one of his tshuvos. Therefore, regarding the law, it is prohibited under the prohibition of thou shalt not murder to abort a fetus, with the single exception the one who kills it is exempt from the death penalty. And because of this, I rule that even if the doctors are saying there's a possibility that the mother may die if the fetus is not killed, although for desecrating Shabbat and violating other commandments, one would do so. In such a case, even for a small concern of life, nevertheless, to kill a fetus would be forbidden until the doctors assess that the likelihood of her death is almost definite. And even if the doctor is being forced by threat of death to perform an abortion, it can appear that he must give up his life rather than do so, although an argument can be made to the contrary. Therefore, this ruling requires greater thought whether one must give up his life rather than perform an abortion. Okay, so whether or not it's Yehareg v'al Ya'avor, he says, is a larger issue. I've written all this because of the great calamity in the world that many governments have allowed the killing of fetuses, among them political leaders in the state of Israel. And countless of fetuses have already been killed, and in these days the greatest need to make a fence around the Torah. How much more so not to take leniencies regarding the prohibition of murder that is so severe. Thus, I was appalled by the response of a learned man in Israel, written to the director of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, who permits the abortion of a Tay-Sachs fetus even beyond 3 months. And he ruled such by prefacing that the prohibition was, according to many decisors, only rabbinic. Right? He's referencing Rabbi Waldenberg. It is clear and simple as I wrote, the law which is made clear by the early rabbis and the decisors of Jewish law, that abortion is prohibited as considered actual murder, whether the fetus is legitimate or illegitimate. Regular fetuses, those which are from Tay-Sachs, it is strictly prohibited, and do not err and rely on the responsum of that learned man. So Rabbi Feinstein is definitely taking this strict approach, and that is certainly, considering the stature of Rabbi Feinstein, an area where that is considered within the mix of deciding Jewish law. For the most part, I would say that the majority of rabbinic voices today, while taking account of Rabbi Feinstein, which is certainly is more of an anchor to hold back being more permissive for abortion, the Rabbi Waldenberg approach definitely is. Stands out. And in particular in Israel today. Just wanted to point out source number 20. This, was in the news in Israel yesterday. Israel abortion reforms approved amid Roe v. Wade crisis. Right, and there's a lot of attention being, what other countries, what are their abortion standards? So, in the Jerusalem Post yesterday, the Knesset Labor, Welfare, and Health Committee on Monday approved abortion reforms in a preliminary reading after the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. The amendment would allow women to apply online to get an abortion, to receive a pharmacological abortion in more accessible places. Shas MK Moshe Arbel said his party was worried that under this law, an abortion that does not abide by halacha will be permitted. And I find that it's an interesting quote because it seems to take for granted that there are abortions that are abiding by halacha, right? He's worried about those that aren't. And so I think that it's very clear that the state of Israel has adopted, the approach as articulated by Rabbi Waldenberg when it comes to abortion. You can look online. The way it works in Israel is that there's certain conditions, there's certain variables. Whether a woman has children already, what her age, marital status, whether the pregnancy was it a result of rape or the like, and there are a number of categories, and then there's a questionnaire, and that's what they're talking about in this article. So does Israel allow for abortion on demand? The answer is no. And I think that that's one of the the matters of dispute, and within the voices and the reaction to this decision, in particular, abortion in general. Judaism doesn't permit abortion on demand, and we'll see how this gets expressed. Maybe with regard, we talk about pro-choice and pro-life. In terms of where we go from here, in terms of policy, in terms of how are we responding, right? We know the Supreme Court made a decision. We've seen some of the reactions, from movements and groups that want to be on the record. We've seen these sources. We've seen how the sources have been analyzed and distilled into halachic practice, both the more permissive, which seems to be the dominant approach, certainly the approach of the state of Israel, I think very widely held, throughout many Orthodox rabbis today. And we've seen the more restrictive approach of Rabbi Feinstein. But where does this take us from an approach to abortion? So it's interesting. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb, source 18, said, in actual practice, the Orthodox Jewish view of abortion is very different from the conservative views of the Catholic Church and from the liberal views of the non-Orthodox Jewish groups. It is nuanced, complex, and depends upon such a variety of factors that categorizing Orthodox Judaism as either pro-life or pro-choice is almost a caricature of our position. Right? This from a previous executive of the organization that was neither able to celebrate nor mourn in the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision. But I wanted to present two approaches that came out recently with regards to, the reversal of Roe v. Wade in terms of, is it good for the Jews or bad for the Jews, or is it a positive development or a negative development? So the first is self-explanatory. Rabbi J. David Bleich writes, why reversal of Roe v. Wade is welcome. And I think it's not a halachic position, but it's kind of we would call a hashkafic or religious value position. So here's an excerpt. You see the whole thing on TorahMusings.com. Rabbi Bleich is one of the foremost expositors of Jewish law and the interface of Jewish law in contemporary society, and he has a number of volumes of his articles in English. He writes in as complicated English as Post can write in Hebrew, and he can write in Hebrew also. Someone who is a force to be reckoned with in the halachic and intellectual world of Orthodoxy. Judaism owes a great debt, a debt of gratitude to the Catholic Church for filling a lacuna we have allowed to develop. Were Rambam alive today, he would respond that the Church deserves accolades for preserving recognition of the sanctity of human life in all of its phases as manifest in categorization of feticide as homicide. Right? The Catholics are against abortion, and they're vocally against abortion. Right? Jews were charged with promulgating that teaching by deed and by word. To our eternal shame, divine providence found other ways to use the argument. So basically, we Jews, we should have been the champions against Roe v. Wade, but we weren't. The argument that the lives of Jewish women will be endangered by rejection of Roe v. Wade is specious, right? Some would say it's a complicated decision, and people, we believe that abortion is allowed sometimes, so we shouldn't be at the forefront of opposing it. That's not true. I dare say that no Jewish woman died as a result of legal restraints prior to Roe v. Wade. No Jewish woman is likely to die in the wake of its repeal. Abortion for medical need will continue to be available in most and probably all jurisdictions. If any lives are lost, it will be because of inability to afford the expense of travel, not because of constitutional impediment. What should the Jewish response be? It should be twofold. One, the establishment of a fund to defray the cost of travel to a jurisdiction which life-threatening pregnancy can be terminated, such a stipend to be limited to women who produce a statement signed by a recognized posek attesting to the halachic propriety of the procedure. Two, a second, far larger fund to provide for care pregnant women who carry their babies to term but feel compelled to surrender them for adoption. This is the response of Rachmanim, B'nai Rachmanim, the merciful people, children of merciful people. And Rabbi Bly says, at the end of the day, you repeal Roe, you repeal permission for abortions. There will always be a place in America for abortions. We live in red states and blue states. There will always be blue states. So we just have to make sure that people have access to the blue states. And he says there should be a fund, and that for people who need to get there, when they have a note from their rabbi that the abortion is necessary. Also, there should be a focus on encouraging families. And this is, have been one of the criticisms that a number of conservative thinkers and writers have written about recently, that it's not, you can't, pro-life doesn't just mean anti-abortion. You have to do things that encourage the sanctity of life or valuing life. So people, who are in difficult situations with unwanted pregnancies, how to care for them, right? That's, as Rabbi Bly concludes, Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim. But, and this was actually something that, there was discussed. There was a panel, Wall Street Journal had a panel of a number of its writers and journalists yesterday. And one made the comment that if, for many Republicans, they're thrilled that there are blue states that Democrats control, that abortion will still be legal. It kind of takes the onus off of them. Yeah, abortion is legal, but the states have the right to go to a state that permits abortion. It kind of, there's this sigh of relief, behind the scenes, that abortions are legal and will always be legal in some of these deep blue states, that takes the onus off of them to, allows them to be so gung-ho anti-abortion, because it's always going to be possible. There's always a solution. And it's interesting how Rabbi Bly, references that sentiment in his approach, that we should be more vigorously opposed to abortion, except when it's permissible, and even if that leads to overly restrictive policies, because there will always be a solution. And one of the solutions is to make sure people have access to it. And he talks about a Jewish communal fund, and then the more broad idea of supporting the idea of family in situations where there are unwanted pregnancies. So, a very muscular oppositional force. Again, not claiming that these are not allowed, that abortions are not allowed from a halakhic perspective, but saying we should be almost like, basically it's a further exposition of maybe some of the logic that goes into an aguda type of a statement. So another way of looking at this, which I think resonates, is Rabbi Jeremy Wieder, who had an article in the Jewish Press. I find it, almost with a smile, that I have to say it's a good article in the Jewish Press. Some of you may still read the Jewish Press. Some of you read it for the ads. Some of you may remember back in the day when the Jewish Press came out, there was a discussion, people sometimes read in the restroom. So can you read the Jewish Press in the restroom because it has, religious content? And then the rejoinder was, well, can you take it out of the bathroom? Anyway, this is an article. Jewish Press is, what I see of it is online. And this is an article from Rabbi Jeremy Wieder, who is one of the Russia Yeshiva at Yeshiva University. Someone who I think is a terrific representative of the best that YU has to offer in modern Orthodoxy. And, in addition to laying out the halakhic arguments, he talks about the pro-life movement originates in the Catholic Church, which prohibits abortion even when the mother's life is in danger, and approach that as anathema to halacha. Interesting that he, Rabbi Bly says that we, the Catholics make us look bad, and Rabbi Wieder is pointing out that, what they represent is not very Jewish. The pro-choice movement, on the other hand, awards primacy to personal autonomy, my body, my choice. Yet many prohibitions, suicide, self-wounding, tearing flesh over the dead, tearing out hair over the dead, cutting of the peyot of the head and beard for men, directly contradict the view that one's body is one's own to do with as one wishes. This is true regarding abortion as well. The movement's slogans too are simplistic. Personal or religious preferences aside, who opposes choice or life, right? Judaism is very pro-life and very pro-choice. The New York Board of Rabbis, of which I'm the incoming president, is trying to come up with a response. And my contribution was, no, we're pro-choice and pro-life. We believe in the sanctity of life, and we value people's abilities to make choices. So the central question presently facing the American Orthodox community relates primarily not to halacha, but rather to the American political arena. Which, if any, position should Orthodox Jews individually or collectively adopt publicly regarding the likely demise of Roe v. Wade and on abortion legislation in general? A generation ago, two Gedolim adopted opposite views of this question. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was in favor of Jews doing everything possible to encourage adherence to Noahide law on the part of Gentiles, including advocacy for legislation that would enforce Noahide law. He seems not to have been concerned about possible negative implications of this approach. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe promoted the adherence to the Noahide commandments, and therefore we want, if abortion is illegal, well then we have to advocate for that. Rav Moshe Feinstein disagreed with the Lubavitcher Rebbe and opposed legislation prohibiting abortion. In general, Rav Feinstein opposed legislation in any area that might give any religion a voice in government matters. He felt that for a small religious minority such as the Jewish people, supporting a firm church-state divide was absolutely necessary, even when such legislation might coincide with the Torah viewpoint, since any breach of the divide could result in government interference with Jewish religious practice. So interesting, Rav Moshe Feinstein, who is very conservative on abortion, viewing it as murder, would still not be in favor of advocating for this to be the policy in America because of what that may do in other situations when it comes to religious legislation and how that might adversely impact Jews. Some may be thinking the Supreme Court also had a decision with regard to prayer, and some are worried about what that may mean. Some Jewish groups are in favor. They feel that the more you have a muscular religion in general society, that's good for the Jews. They're less worried, as Rabbi Feinstein was, about what would happen when that muscular religion may oppose or push aside some of the Jewish preferences. But here you see Rabbi Weider presenting it not as something that we should lament the fact that we didn't protest as loudly as the Catholic Church. Pro-choice and pro-life, neither of them are positions that have real standing within as independent oppositional entities within Jewish theology or Jewish thought or Jewish society. But really, it's about, are we trying to push our views on others or not? And for the most part, we want the government to not interfere, and we see that this is something that's starting to be discussed. There's different First Amendment challenges to abortion, whether people can say, well, since my rabbi says I should get an abortion, whether denying me that right is denying of religious freedom. These are all issues that are starting to play out in the broader society. I saw one reaction to that. I think it was a synagogue in Florida which wanted to file suit that it was in the religious directives, it was in their religion to get an abortion, and there was a group that was countering it because the synagogue that was filing suit demanding the religious freedom is a Reform synagogue which doesn't believe in Jewish law. So there was a countersuit that this religious synagogue doesn't have standing from a religious perspective because they don't feel bound by religion in general. That's mentioned in their bylaws. So anyway, I have not yet begun to fight. This issue still has a long way to go, but we have seen that I think that the OU said it very well. Right, this is not a clear-cut victory. It's not a terrible defeat, but it is the continuation of a complicated process unfolding into a new chapter. And which, when it comes to abortion as a concept, Jewish law definitely has. I think the view as articulated by Rabbi Waldenberg really carries the day in practical Jewish law in terms of politics and society and where we advocate as a community. People will, their politics may guide them, and I do think the OU was right, and also by saying that this is far too complicated a decision. And far too nuanced that hopefully we won't shout past each other, but we'll find a way to speak with each other. So that summarizes the issue, and I'll be happy to hear some reactions, questions, comments, and the like.